I'm Tommy Sheridan. I'm a former member of the Scottish Parliament between 1999 and 2007. I was also the chairman of the All Britain Anti-Poll Tax Federation in the late 1980s and was involved in the campaign to defeat the poll tax and consign Mrs Thatcher to the political dustbin of history where she belonged. And after that, as I say, I was elected to the Scottish Parliament. We also served as a Glasgow councillor between the years of 1992 and 2003, so 11 years as a Glasgow city councillor, always as a socialist.
Yes, so could you just describe your first encounter with Alex Salmond and how you came to? I mean, you must obviously have worked with him over the years, but how did he first arrive on your horizon?
My first encounter with Alec would have been in the late 80s, around about 89. The SNP, the Scottish National Party, which Alec became the leader of at the time when I met him, he wasn't the leader. But the SNP had adopted a very radical position on the poll tax at the time because they were seen as a mainstream political party. They had about 4 members of parliament, including Alex Salmond, and they decided to adopt a civil disobedience stance, which was can pay, won't pay in relation to the poll tax. So they were very, very helpful in Scotland in providing some legitimacy in the political field for the anti-poll tax campaign, because at the time the Labour Party disgracefully turned their back on the grassroots anti-poll tax campaign and effectively called for their councillors to send out sheriff officers to harass and harangue the poor who couldn't afford to pay the poll tax. So SNP's
but for those that don't remember, Tommy, sorry to interrupt you, but for those that don't remember, it was introduced in Scotland, as I remember, before the rest of the UK. Almost they were kind of using you as guinea pigs.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary feat of Thatcher's vindictiveness that should come to no surprise to anyone who knows anything about Mrs Thatcher. Many of your listeners might not actually remember her, but she was a very malevolent woman in politics. And she hated Scotland because in 1979, when she was elected in England, she was rejected in Scotland. In 1983, she was rejected in Scotland. In 1987, she was rejected in Scotland. And she hated that. She hated the fact that the Scots hated her. So she decided after the 87 election that her new flagship policy, which she called the community charge, which was basically a policy to transfer wealth from the poor to the rich by scrapping the existing rates system, which was a property on buildings, a tax on property, which meant that those in big properties paid more than those in smaller council properties. And she didn't like that. She wanted to help out the people that voted for her. So she decided to introduce a head tax called the community charge, which became known as the poll tax. But to rub some salt in the political wounds, she decided to introduce it in Scotland first. So we got it on the 1st of April, 1989, but it wasn't to be introduced to England and Wales until the 1st of April, 1990. So we had to fight the poll tax for a whole year before England joined the battle, England and Wales. And the SNP, as I said, they played a role in that battle because they refused to cower, they refused to bend the knee the way the Labour Party did, in accepting that even though the poll tax was described as being immoral, unjust, unfair, they still expected people to pay it. How you could pay something that's immoral is beyond me. It's a misuse of language, but that's what the Labour Party did. So Alec and I shared numerous platforms during the anti-poll tax campaigns throughout the late 1980s, 88, 89, right into 1990. And Alex was a formidable speaker, a formidable organiser and campaigner, and he was very significant in, as I say, giving legitimacy to the idea of mass civil disobedience, because at the time, people like myself, we were seen as the dregs of society, and people looked down their noses at us because we were building in the housing estates of Glasgow and Scotland. But with Alec being in Parliament and a Labour MP who became a rebel, who later defected and joined the SNP from Labour Party, a guy called Dick Douglas in Fife, they were willing to stand by us. There was a few, don't get me wrong, the campaign group of Labour MPs at the time, people like Jeremy Corbyn, people like George Galloway, they actually supported the mass non-payment campaign. They were notable exceptions within the
Well, it's
Labour
interesting that Salmond was doing this, because he started off, didn't he, as the Royal Bank of Scotland as an economist. It's not the sort of person you expect to be encouraging civil disobedience in the way that you describe as a socialist. Quite an intriguing character.
I don't think Alec, to be fair to Alec, would ever have described himself as a socialist. He always described himself as a social democrat, but a social democrat in the proper use of the term. He believed in democracy, he believed in social justice, but he also believed in the market and the market's ability to produce things, and he believed the market should be regulated. He wasn't a free market capitalist in that respect. But I would have to say that it's unfair to sort of define Alec from his main job as an oil economist with the Royal Bank of Scotland. Alec was born in a council house in a council estate in Linlithgow, so he was a working class lad who went to St Andrews University and was a very clever lad, and discovered Scottish history and Scottish politics at a very, very early age, and became a Scottish nationalist and someone who was committed to the cause of Scotland returning its sovereignty, a sovereignty that had some 300 years prior. So he, at the time when he joined the SNP, it's very important for listeners to understand that that was a cause at the time that was almost a cult. It was viewed as something that was akin to an obscure book club. It's easy to look at SNP now as a mass party, and a party with representation across the UK and running the Scottish government. It wasn't always thus. When Alec was involved, it was a very small organisation, relatively speaking, but it had a big heart, and it was designed to deliver an independent Scotland. Alec and I always fought for an independent socialist Scotland. Alec would have fought for an independent, socially just Scotland. So we shared enough to be on the same side. We would disagree about whether oil and gas and electricity should be publicly owned. Alec would probably have agreed with gas and electricity publicly owned, but not perhaps with oil. But he did latterly very, very firmly believe that the wind power industry, which Scotland is blessed with, that clean technology should be publicly owned. He absolutely lambasted the SNP government for selling the rights to our clean technology for literally buttons in terms of the real value of the clean technology, because we have got vast resources of wind and wave power, so much so that we produce more power than we need in Scotland, and we export power to England. Not everyone knows that, but we do. And we could become, in terms of clean technology, the Saudi Arabia of Europe in terms of the comparison with oil, because we have got so much abundant resources. So Alec believed it should be publicly owned. Latterly, Alec also moved to the position of supporting an independent republic. During the referendum, Alec fought the referendum on the basis of the white paper, which was a a very detailed exposition of the case for independence, but it was short on some areas, some significant areas, which I often raised during my campaigning in support of independence. One of those areas was the monarchy. Alec used to campaign for a slimmed down monarchy, and I used to say I didn't want a slimmed down monarchy. I don't want to put any of them on a diet. I just want rid of them completely. And latterly, Alec confessed to me he's now moved. He believes in a republic. And he said it was only because he knew the Queen and found her quite a pleasant person. But once she died, he no longer, because he never ever believed in the institution of the monarchy, it was just the person. He's also moved on Europe. I was very, very clear during the referendum campaign that the European Union for me was a right-wing organisation, originally formed as a bulwark against socialism. It was a bulwark in favour of promoting free market capital. I was in the Tony Benn wing of the Labour movement in opposition to the European Union, and said so. What I did say was that Scotland should decide on that question, but voting for independence isn't necessarily voting to be a member of the European Union. We should vote for independence, and then we should have our own referendum on that question. Alec, on the other hand, believed in the European Union, but again, latterly, Alec's position was clearly that not to rejoin the European Union, but to join the European Free Trade Agreement, to take an EFTA stance, which I actually agree with 100%. I want to do a Norway and a Switzerland. It's done them the world of good.
Well, yeah, this is something quite interesting with the EU, isn't it? That you've got the Irish, for example. People poke fun at them, saying, well, you spent all that time and effort wriggling out of the British Empire and away from the English, only to embrace Brussels as your masters. So, what also, of course, another biggie when it comes to independence is Faslane. What about that?
On Faslane, Alec was absolutely incontrovertible for removal of nuclear weapons. I mean, in many respects, Tony, for any progressive listener to this show, they have to understand the stakes in 2014 were utterly massive in terms of geopolitics. It wasn't just about breaking up Britain, which, quite frankly, as a socialist and anyone who's progressive who gets the opportunity to break up an imperialist state, they should have been supporting it instead of taking a neutral position or even opposing it. Because when you get the chance to break up an imperial power, then we should grab it with both hands, especially when you don't have to lift a weapon to do so, neither a claymore or an armour light. So from our point of view, breaking with Britain meant sending the nuclear weapons out of Scotland. We said quite clearly that we did not wish to host nuclear weapons, and if we voted for independence, Faslane would close. And that was absolutely united across the movement. No one who supported independence thought any different to that. That's why, if you think about it, Tony, why else would the Chinese premier, why would Barack Obama, why would Putin at the time all be asked a couple of weeks before the referendum by David Cameron, begging on his knees to get involved in the question and to come out in opposition to independence? That's why the bank chiefs, that's why the B&Q, the Tesco chiefs, the shipyard owners, they were all brought in those last couple of weeks to issue statements and issue letters to staff warning against the dangers of independence, all because a few weeks before the referendum of September 18th, 2014, one poll put Scotland, put the yes ahead. It looked as though Scotland was going to defy all the odds and vote for independence, despite the British state being so against it. So everyone was mobilised to try and stop that from happening, because that would have been a disaster for British imperialism and for British capitalism, because regardless of any of the propaganda that you read, Scotland doesn't get subsidised by England. Scotland subsidises England, and that's just an economic fact of life. So from the point of view of what Alec was prepared to do, he was prepared to put himself at the head of a movement to break the British state. And I supported him 100% with that. As I say, we had small nuances of differences in 2014, but nothing that would stop us from being marching behind the same banner. And Alec,
well, this brings us up to the rift with Sturgeon, because he handed over power, didn't he, after he lost that independence referendum in 2014 to Nicola Sturgeon. And then, I mean, Nicola and him had been on, very, very close, it seemed, for many years. What was that about, though, do you think, the rift between Sturgeon and Salmond?
It was more than a rift, Tony. It was a spectacular miscalculation of judgment on Alex's part. I, about a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, had a head-to-head with Alec. Actually, it's been, now that I'm thinking about it, sometimes you get mixed up because of the COVID years, Tony. You forget the COVID years and how much they affected you. In 2021, Alec launched Alba. I met with Alec therefore in about 2022. I joined Alba at the time, and I met him in our lawyer's office and had a meeting with him where I said to him, of course, Alec, you're partly responsible for the demise of the independence movement because you handed the baton to Nicola. And his reply to me at that time was, yes, but I didn't know at the time that she was a compulsive effing liar. So he thoroughly accepted that it was his fault, or it was partly his fault, but he believes it was a failure in his judgment. Nicola was given an absolutely massive legacy by Alex Salmond. You've got to remember, round about 2012, 2013, when Alec had just won the 2011 Scottish Parliament election and defied all of the electoral arithmetic to get a majority government of the Scottish Parliament, despite the way it was formed to try and prevent any party getting a majority. Alec used that to pressurise Cameron to agree to a referendum. That became the Edinburgh Agreement of 2013. And Cameron only agreed, British state only agreed, because independence at that time, support for independence was around 21, 22%. Some polls had it as high as 23. I think the social attitude survey at one time had it at 25. But we were quite clearly seen as a minority, a quite significant minority. And Cameron thought, there's no danger here, there's no way they'll win a referendum. Alex's legacy is that he took that 22, 23% and turned it into 45. At one time, he had it up as high as 51. That's why the British state moved into overdrive in those last few weeks of the campaign. Alex's mistake, in my opinion, and it's easy, we're all very, very wise in retrospect. Retrospect makes us all very wise men and women. But Alex's mistake was to resign too early. I know he did it for honourable reasons, but he thought that he was responsible for the defeat. You've got to remember, within 9 months of that defeat, the SNP had a truly remarkable result at the British election. It's very, very sad if you think of this woman Thatcher that I had talked about earlier, because she used to always throw jibes at Alex Salmond and other SNP MPs in Parliament. She used to say, listen, if you want your independence, all you need to do is send a majority of MPs to this place, and then you can have your independence. Well, in 2015 at the British general election, Tony, the SNP sent 56 out of 59 MPs to Parliament. 56 out of 59. That's the legacy of Alex Salmond. That's what was handed to Nicola Sturgeon. And Nicola Sturgeon then won the election in 2017 with less of a majority, but still a majority, 35 out of the 59. and then won 2019 with 41 out of the 56. And then in 2021, still returned, I think it was 39 out of the 56. In other words, Nicola Sturgeon was handed a legacy from Mr. Salmond, which was utterly, clearly a pro-independence legacy, and she failed to deliver on that legacy. She failed to move the independence dial forward one iota. She gave up the legacy of competent government, socially just government. She became utterly obsessed with a deal with the Greens in the Scottish Parliament. The Greens became obsessed with the self-ID culture. Gender politics began to dominate Scottish parliamentary affairs, so much so that important bills like rent restrictions, building ferries, other important aspects of Scottish everyday life was put on hold in order to fight a gender ID battle, which was to defy science, to defy biology, to allow a 16-year-old, after 3 months of declaring that they were a man or a woman, to be able to live in that declared self-identified gender, which was just ridiculous, completely and utterly ridiculous, and has now been seen to be ridiculous, and is now unfolding at a rate of knots here in Scotland. So Sturgeon gave all of that up. However, around about 2019, late 2019, Alec, because of the failure of Nicola Sturgeon, had given an indication that there was a by-election going to be coming up in the Aberdeen area, and that he was maybe interested in putting his hat in the ring. That started a course of events which won't be revealed in full technicolor until a number of court cases are played out in full, but they will be. And once they are played out in full, you will see a political conspiracy, the likes of which we've never probably seen in British politics. A conspiracy to destroy a man, to destroy his reputation, to destroy him as an individual, to accuse him of heinous crimes of harassment, including rape, all of which he was completely exonerated of by a jury of his peers, majority women, who listened to evidence against him, which was utter tripe, which was completely manufactured, which was part of a conspiracy. Alex stood up to it. It took a toll on his health, took a toll on his life. He said to me it was the most stressful thing he'd ever faced in his life. I was out with Alex only 4 weeks ago for a meal with my wife and Alex, and his right-hand supporter and political agent, Tasmina. And Alec told me that nearly destroyed him, going through the stress of that court case. But he did. He won it in 2020. And the mark of the man, that was Alex Salmond, was after he won it, he made clear that there were things that he couldn't reveal in the court because the judge had refused them to be revealed, but they would be revealed in the course of time, and they would show a mammoth conspiracy. However, he went on to say this is not the time to discuss these matters, because a much more important matter is the health of the nation, and everyone should follow the instructions that are being issued by the health service because of COVID. And obviously we then went into an extraordinary period in all of our lives through the lockdown and the shutdown that we experienced. So Alec,
well, I mean, that's a fascinating thing you're saying, but do you think that will ever be revealed now?
Yes, utterly. I don't think I can say with certainty that it will. As I said earlier about the meeting with Alec in my lawyer's office, my lawyer is also Alec's lawyer, and that lawyer has made it absolutely clear that the various legal actions that he has been pursuing on Alex's behalf will continue as long as the executors of Alex will decide that to be. and there is every indication that that will be the case. So these legal cases are not going away. The Scottish Government...
Yeah, well, I hope so, because, I mean, you know, it sounds from the case that there was at least some degree of perjury going on there, and you know, political conspiracy against Alec. Yeah.
But that's to minimise the size of the crime that was committed. Each and every one of those
as an aside, Tommy, you've got a peculiar situation in Scotland, haven't you, where all of the various police forces were consolidated into one. I wonder if that has played a part in all.
You know, of all of the arms of the state that have been involved in this situation, and this will come as a surprise from a socialist, the police are lent on often, there's no doubt about that. But the Crown Prosecution and Fiscal Service in Scotland is much more corrupt than the police. And it's much more corrupt because many of the top appointees are political appointments. So you had the situation where the friends of the Scottish Government were actually taking decisions at the highest level of the prosecution and fiscal service about what avenues to pursue and what prosecutions to decide on. And that's been a big problem. The civil service is another huge problem because they were taking their instructions by the Scottish Government. And once there's a thing called the alphabet names. This is a group of accusers of Alex Salmond. And it's incredible when you think about it, because these are the accusers of Alex Salmond whose evidence was found to be unreliable by a jury of peers. This unreliable evidence, we are not allowed to know who gave it, because they have been given, in perpetuity, they've been given the cover, a blanket cover of anonymity. Now, the reason for anonymity in potential rape cases was very, very clear, and I supported it as a parliamentarian at the time. It was because of the fear that if a witness or an accuser was to be revealed, they may be intimidated, and it may therefore prevent others from coming forward. So I can understand why anonymity is available for accusers and those giving evidence in rape trials. However, it was only ever supposed to last until a verdict. The idea that you can be found guilty of charges of rape and the anonymity of the accuser is kept is fine because you've been found guilty. But the idea that you're found not guilty, that the accuser's evidence has been found to be so unreliable that it couldn't convict you, but you can still keep your anonymity, but the person who's accused is blasted all over court and all over papers. It's an utter unfairness in the justice system. Of course it's unfair, and it was never meant to be that way. But these names will be revealed, and these names being revealed, Tony, will shock a lot of people. A lot of people think it's, so inverted commas, ordinary people. There's nothing ordinary about these people. Every one of them are part and parcel of the political machinery in Scotland at the very highest level. And that's when the whole conspiracy will become clear to people who don't yet understand the level of the conspiracy and how high it went, how well organised it was. So that will happen, Tony, in the fullness of time.
Well, I hope so.
Alex Salmond was already vindicated in a court case, but he will be further vindicated when these court cases proceed.
There was another reason that certain parts of the establishment took against Alec, and that is he had a programme on RT, didn't he, as well, which he was encouraged to give up, but he refused.
Well, you know, again, for the appropriateness of fact, it's very important that we make this point. Alex Salmond produced a talk show. RT didn't produce the talk show. RT purchased the talk show. So in other words, for those who try and throw this slander, and it's not slander to me, of course it's no slander to me, because I'm not Russian phobic. I remember, if it wasn't for the Russians, we'd all be speaking German just now. So I don't have any Russian phobia whatsoever. On the contrary, but some people throw this dirt at Alec. Oh yeah, he worked for Russian TV. He never worked for Russian TV. Alec produced independently a talk show that RT bought from him. It could have been bought by Sky. It could have been bought by the BBC. It could have been bought by ITV, but they didn't want it. So that's what happened in terms of that, and that annoyed a lot of people because Alec had a platform then to promote Scotland's independence and to promote other issues of importance of an international character. I mean, you've got to remember, Tony, Alec committed a very, very serious sin way back in 1999 when Alec was one of the only well-known parliamentarians that was willing to come out and call the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia a war crime. He called it a war crime because there was no United Nations resolution to give NATO the power, to give them the legitimacy, to give them the go-ahead to bomb a sovereign country. They did it, and they bombed it for 30-odd nights and caused all sorts of death and destruction. And Alex Salmond stood out against it, and he was absolutely lambasted for that. He was called Milosevic's puppet and everything else. All he was doing, because he believed in law, all he was doing was upholding law, international law. So Alec has always, and recently Alec has been very, very clear that Israel should be taken to The Hague for war crimes, that no one should be selling weapons to Israel because of the genocide that they're committing in Gaza and have done over the last 12 months, and for the illegal occupation over the last 7 decades. So Alec has always been on the right side of history as far as these big international issues are concerned. And as I said at the very outset of this discussion, Tony, Alec and I weren't of the same political stock, in that I was a declared socialist, Alec was a declared social democrat, but we agreed on much more than what we disagreed on. And that meant that we were comrades, that meant that we were in the same political party, and that meant that I had a lot of respect for Alec.
It's difficult to find people in British politics anywhere with the sort of stature of people like Alec now. I mean, I'm thinking also about, characters like Robin Cook as well, with that integrity, with that moral fibre. What's happened?
It's a good question, Tony. I mentioned there the 1989 campaign against the poll tax, and I remember as a much younger lad going down to Westminster to address the campaign group of MPs, and if memory serves me right, there was nearly 30 at that meeting, and we got the support of the campaign group of MPs. Now, in those days, you had the steel of Tony Benn, maybe giving other people encouragement. You also had Jeremy there, and you had several others who were stoic in the belief that socialism wasn't just a buzzword, it was actually a cause. Nowadays, I'm afraid, Tony, the Labour Party, in my eyes, is a shameful organisation, an organisation that should be utterly opposed by any socialist and any trade unionist. Simply their position in relation to Gaza and the genocide being committed by Israel is enough on its own, never mind the economic situation and their economic policies in terms of protecting the rich and battering their pensioners with the removal of the heating allowance. Never mind the fact that they have got no priority in terms of reversing wealth in favour of ordinary people. Just that one single policy of supporting Israel should be enough to tell any socialist worth their salt. In fact, never mind any socialist, Tony, any progressive, anyone who believes in social justice. If you can support a Labour Party that supports a genocidal maniac in the shape of Israel, then you really need to question your conscience, and you really need to question your morals and your moral compass. So I've got no time for anybody left in the Labour Party. I think they should have left a long time ago. I think that Jeremy was forced to leave. I believe he is trying to perhaps build something from the grassroots up. I know there are other organisations. I know George Galloway. I'm personal friends with George. I disagree with George on the question of Scottish independence, but I agree with him on many other things. So there are many good left-wing orators. There are very few elected representatives that are left, but we are sadly lacking, aren't we, Tony, in having a political organisation that we could give our support to, that we could commit our time and energy to. I wish Jeremy and the trade union movement would form something that actually stands for socialism instead of having this horrific caricature of a Labour Party, which Sir Starmer actually leads just now. I mean, I suppose the clue's in the name, isn't it, Tony? Anybody who's a Sir is certainly not going to do anything to upset the British Empire, is he?
Look, if I could just take you back to your last meeting with Alec, I mean, you know, what we're looking at now is I mean, if we're in a situation where, for example, with the water industry, you know, there is a Labour government, there is a disaster in the water industry. The companies that took it over privatized when it was privatized are basically bankrupt, and yet the idea is apparently to refinance them. So the other, you know, with doing some sort of deal where the public is going to be having to pay anything up to 60-70% more for their water. I just wonder if this is the sort of thing that featured in Alex's mind, and maybe you could just leave us with some thoughts of that final meeting.
My meal with Alex about 4 weeks ago was a great night. We had lots of wonderful stories to share, lots of laughs. We talked about the 2026 Scottish Parliament elections and the need for Alba to make a breakthrough and the desire to put up a formidable team of candidates for that election. And we then met so almost a week later at the Hope Over Fear 10th anniversary independence rally in George Square in Glasgow, at which Alec addressed. And he addressed it with some vigour, with huge substance and passion and energy. We then had an event that night that Alec himself had organised, which was a 10-year celebration at the Scottish Hydro, where he brought together broadcasters and MPs from SNP and from other parties who had played a role in the independence referendum of 2014. And Alec was full of ideas, full of energy and full of commitment. He was absolutely unflappable in his belief that we would secure independence in his lifetime. There's no doubt in his mind on that. On the issue that you raise, of course, we had different conversations because, as you probably are aware, Scotland's water is public, so we don't have private water. We never allowed our water to be privatised, unlike in England and Wales, which has been an utter disaster and a completely immoral project. Why on earth would you allow your water to be owned by private individuals when it's such an important factor of life? That same argument, of course, can be applied to gas and electricity. The fact that we allowed gas and electricity to be privatised was a disgrace, and to her eternal shame, Nicola Sturgeon announced in 2016 that the Scottish Government was going to introduce a bill to form a Scottish energy company so that energy would be returned to the public hands in Scotland. And everyone cheered. Unfortunately, she ditched it 3 years later, which was an utter betrayal. However, under Alex's guidance, we did return the railways to public ownership. We don't have tuition fees in Scotland because of Alex Salmond, so our education isn't private either. We don't have road tolls on our bridges because of Alec. We don't have prescription charges on our medicines because of Alec. So he leaves a gigantic legacy, Tony. And the one important point that I would make is that his last tweet, he tweeted only hours before he sadly fell to his death on Saturday, and he was tweeting at the time about the meeting of the various mayors in Scotland that Starmer had organised, and he was having a go at John Swinney, the current First Minister, for agreeing to even take part in it, because he made the point that Scotland is a country, not a county. And that is something that will be inscribed in our banners from now on in, alongside his other famous statement when he resigned prematurely after the defeat of the 2014 referendum, when he said the dream will never die. And that dream will never die, Tony, not while people like me and hundreds of thousands, millions like us continue to believe in a socially just and free Scotland, and will continue to fight for it.
Tommy, can you just let listeners know whereabouts they can find you and follow you on social media, etc.?
Sure. If listeners wish to follow me on X, I'm Citizen Tommy on X. You'll find me there. And you will see that I regularly send out posts and reposts that condemn the heinous genocide that's been carried out in Gaza by Israel. And I also oppose the Russian phobic attitude that is so widely promoted across the West as well.
Okay, Tommy Sheridan, thanks very much for joining us.
My name is Hugh Kerr. I'm the former member of the European Parliament for Essex West and Hertfordshire East. I spent a lifetime in the Labour Party until I was expelled by Tony Blair in 1998 for opposing his policies on almost everything. I came back to Scotland in 1999 and helped to found the Scottish Socialist Party along with Tommy Sheridan, became its first chair, its first press officer. And that indeed is when I met Alex Salmond for the first time in the European elections, of course, of that period, which I was number one on the list for the SSP. And Alec, I always remember him at the count. He said, "Who is this bloody DeHont fellow who invented this system?" Because he was very near to getting 2 MSPs instead of 1. One, of course, the existing one was Winnie Ewing, who was a good friend of mine. Winnie was the mother of Scottish nationalism and independence. Alex undoubtedly is the current father and, of course, sadly deceased father of Scottish independence and the SNP. So Winnie was a good friend of mine at Strasbourg in Brussels. Many a glass of bubbles we had together. And she invited me to join the SNP when I was expelled from the Labour Party by Tony Blair. But I said, "Look, Winnie, I'm a socialist." She said, "But we've got socialists in the SNP, Hugh." I said, "Yeah, you've also got Liberals, Tories, and people with no politics at all." So I said, "Leave it with me." I said, "We will work together when I come back to Scotland." And we did. Winnie and I used to meet regularly, and Alec and I met regularly, discussed and liaising how the left and the SNP could work together. So that's when I met Alec first of all. I've known him for about 30 years now, and very sad, of course, about his loss, as we all are. And of course, I was a member of the Alba party, which Alec founded when he got he broke with the SNP when they tried.
But before we run too far forward,
sure.
Can you say something about this whole business of devolution and Blair? Because we can look back on this as a sort of poison chalice that Blair was emptying there, almost offering the Scots something which was going to cause division. But ultimately, of course, it came to nothing with the referendum. So how did that all happen?
Well, of course, there's a long history behind it, like 300 years. Scotland was a nation for 900 years before it was bought over and forced to join the Act of Union in 1707. In fact, Winnie Ewing wonderfully reopened the Scottish Parliament by saying the Scottish Parliament will now reopen after its interruption. Its interruption was 293 years, but in 1707 it was forced to join with the the union with England because they had an army at the borders. They threatened to cut off all foreign trade. And only about 10% of the population of Scotland had a vote in 1707. The bourgeoisie essentially were represented in the Scottish Parliament, and they were bought over by English gold, as Robert Burns recalls in his famous song. So there's a long history, of course, of people pushing for independence, and of what happened towards the last 20 or 30 years before the setting up of the Scottish Parliament, as people began to see devolution, limited power Scottish Parliament, as the answer to quell this uprising. In fact, even the Tories were in favour of it originally. Under Thatcher, she promised it. And then Labour, under Donald Dewar in particular, was very keen on it. And of course, they hoped that this would quell the rise of the SNP. In fact, George Robertson went on to be General Secretary of NATO, said, the devolution of Scotland will kill the SNP stone dead. Well, I met him a few years after. I said, well, that didn't work, George, did it? And they said, no, that was a slight mistake. Because, of course, what it did was to allow the SNP to flourish in a parliament and eventually win a majority in it, which convinced people that actually they were competent running the country, and therefore independence, well, that might not be a step too far.
No, okay. So can you say something about Alex's rise? Because the SNP do it extremely well under his tutorship, didn't it?
It did extremely well. Alex succeeded the old guard of the SNP, Billy Wolfe and Gordon Wilson, in, I think, about 89. And his first step, there was only 3 MPs from the SNP in the House of Commons. And he made a bit of an impact by interrupting the budget, getting himself thrown out. In other words, he went down there to create a fuss for Scotland, not to settle in, sadly, as many of the more recent MPs have done, including my own one. Tommy Sheridan was an old Labour man from Hackney, who first speech said, we haven't come here to upset the apple cart, which is, of course, what they should have done. So Alec began to make an impression there, and an importance, of course, in Scotland began to develop the SNP into a much more well-organised party, which began to make an impact. And so in the first Scottish Parliament, they, I think, elected about 26 MSPs, and then later on, 2007, got more, and then 2011 achieved a majority, which, of course, the system under de Hont of the additional list system is really meant to prevent any one party getting a majority. That Alec managed in 2011, the only leader of a party who's ever managed to do that in the 25 years of the Scottish Parliament. So Alec was a giant amongst, to be frank, pygmies in the Scottish Parliament. I mean, in the old days, there were some people like Donald Dewar, of course, and Jack McConnell, who had been around for a time. But Alex was head and shoulders above them all. In fact, he was, him, Tommy Sheridan, Alex Neil, John McCallion. There were 3 or 4 really great speakers in the first Scottish Parliament. And Alex was one of those.
There's a sort of irony, isn't there, about the 2014 independence referendum, because this was always the great goal of the SNP, and yet the people didn't want it, and there was a vote against it, and that actually precipitated the resignation of Alex and the rise of this lady called Nicola Sturgeon. So there was something very ironic about that, first of all, that but also maybe you could say something about this relationship with Sturgeon.
Yes, well, let me first of all correct you about the referendum. Firstly, of course, Alec got the referendum because in 2011 he won a majority of seats in the Scottish Parliament, and that convinced David Cameron, who was the Prime Minister at the time, the Tory, on the radio this morning, and it convinced Cameron that he was entitled, therefore, to have a referendum in Scotland. Now, at that time, the support for independence for Scotland was running about 28% in Scotland. So Cameron thought, this will be a doddle, it'll get wiped away and it'll be swept away for a generation. Now, what happened, of course, is that the support went up from 28% finally to 45%. But crucially, and this is the point people in England should understand, Tony, the majority of Scots who were born in Scotland voted for independence in 2014. The majority against was made up of a substantial number of English people who had moved to Scotland, cheaper property and all that, and the European citizens who were entitled to vote in the Scottish referendum because Westminster allowed them to vote. because they were deemed to be voting on local issues, and the EU regulations, and I know I helped to draft them, allowed you to vote in local government, whatever country you were in Europe, and therefore they were deemed to be able to vote in the Scottish Parliament elections in 2014. Now, the campaign against independence said to the EU citizens, if you vote for independence, you will be thrown out of the European Union. Ironically, 2 years later, they weren't allowed to vote on Brexit because they were told they weren't British citizens. And of course, they were thrown out of Europe because of Brexit. Similarly, the English people who'd come to live in Scotland said, we don't want to cut our ties to England. And what will happen to our pensions? Lots of lies and propaganda were used. But the key factor, and John Curtis, Professor John Curtis is the authority in this, will tell you, his research shows the majority of Scottish people who lived in Scotland, were born in Scotland, voted for independence in 2014. And crucially, and the demographics, it was the older people, pensioners 65 plus, who were against independence, the young under 35, heavily in favour of 35 to 55, more or less evenly split. So the history of the demographics is that Scotland will have a majority of independence over the next 10 years.
Well, whatever you say about the rights and wrongs of who was voting and who wasn't, I mean, surely Alec would have been crazy to take on that referendum with the possibility of losing it. I mean, he must have thought about these things beforehand.
But he did, and he knew that with a good campaign, then we could win the victory, even though European citizens and English people were voting. For example, in Denmark, you can't vote on constitutional questions unless you've been a Danish citizen for at least 10 years. So it was very unusual for this voting pattern. Alex thought we could win it. And of course, he got from 28% to 45%. In fact, there was a Sunday Times poll 3 weeks before the election, which had a majority in favour of independence. And at that point, they released a whole barrage of attacks from England, including, threats by all the Royal Bank of Scotland and so on, that they would leave the country. And Gordon Brown and the Daily Record, which was the Labour unionist paper, produced this great vow, it was called the vow, Gordon's vow, that there would be much more attention given to Scotland under devolution, that they'd be allowed to run their own affairs and so on, if they voted to stay. And that vow did shift a lot of people and said, oh, well, and also they threatened to take away Scotland's right to use the pound, which was a nonsense. So it's actually the Bank of England was founded by a Scotsman, and we were actually just as legitimately able to use it as well. So all of those scares worked a trick, and we lost them by 45 to 55%. So it was very close, and it could have been won. And Alex, I think, then decided that he had made a mistake, and therefore he should let the next generation take on. Interestingly, just before he died, he admits that was a mistake. He should not have stood down and not allowed, certainly, Nicola Sturgeon to take over, who then did nothing for independence for the last 10 years.
Can I just get one thing straight? Is it Alec or Alex?
Alexander. So it's Alex, A-L-E-X.
There's a lot of people called him Alec.
I know. Well, you know how Alec and Alex often get mixed up. His name is Alexander, and he's known as Alex in a shorthand way.
And what about his religious faith? There is some sort of hint that was quite an important factor.
It wasn't important. He was a member of the Church of Scotland, nominally a Christian. He didn't flout it a lot. In fact, one of the last events I saw him was an Alba bun supper where he played the Reverend I Am Jolly, which is a great character in Scottish entertainment by Ricky Fulton, which is a send-up of a Scottish minister, and he did it really well. He was a very funny man, Alec, had a great sense of humour, a great sense of laughter and joy, and he did this very well. Now, he wasn't deeply religious. He might have been nominally a Christian, but a lot of people are, but it doesn't affect them terribly much.
Well, and also sometimes people don't flaunt their faith, do they? They keep it rather quiet,
sure.
And,
absolutely.
Anyway, what about Sturgeon, this relationship? A fascinating relationship, because he seemed to completely trust her to take on the party that he'd built up.
That's right, and he admits that was a mistake too. Nicola had been a young SNP activist from Irvine, from my part of the world in Ayrshire, and she'd been groomed by Alec and mentored and helped. She was a lawyer. The truth is, she was not a very good lawyer. In fact, she got reported for various malfunctions as a lawyer and gave up to become a politician. Got elected on the list system in Glasgow initially, and then later on as an individual constituency MSP. So Nicola was and she had said that she might go for the leadership, but when Alec decided to come back from Westminster, he went down to Westminster for a time, and I talked to him about that, and he said, Hugh, it's going to take some time before we're ready for a majority in the Scottish Parliament, so I'm going to go down to Westminster for a time, perform there, and he did it very effectively. Nicola decided to stand, but as soon as Alec decided to stand, she stood down as his deputy, and so she took over. It was a mistake by Alec. He admitted that in the end. He said, I thought I could hand it on safely to the new generation, and that generation would carry us forward to independence. The truth is, Nicola was not terribly interested in independence. She was much more interested in other things, gender issues and all the rest of it, which have focused on Scotland the past 10 years. The other thing is, she didn't have the strategic vision that Alec has, or had rather sadly, in terms of how to judge political movements, how to make moves, how to make shifts, and so on. She was also a control freak, that nothing happened in the Scottish government unless Nicola approved it, which meant a lot of things happened rather badly. And the truth is, the great success period of the SNP was under the first period of the SNP government, 2007 to 2014, when Alex stood down. The great achievements like abolishing student fees, abolishing prescription charges, all the good things of the SNP government all came in that first period. In the last 10 years, there are not many good things, and a lot of incompetence has come out of the SNP.
Yeah, can you say something about those various differences that there now are, which devolution has achieved? It's almost as if the England and Wales have gone off in a actually quite a dark direction towards much more corporate commercialisation of the state institutions. What is it that Scotland has now still retains of its state apparatus and state support that England and Wales don't have anymore?
Well, Scotland is a naturally social democratic country. It's always had a tradition. In fact, in the 1997 election, we removed all the Tory MPs from Scotland. But of course, 1955, there was a majority of Tory MPs elected in Scotland. So Scotland has changed in the past 50, 60 years and has become much more of a social democratic country. Not a socialist country yet, but a social democratic country. And therefore, the fact that the SNP administration were competent under Alec and removed tuition fees from higher education, which of course were being introduced in England, and made prescription charges free, removed car park charges from hospitals, kept the NHS free in access. All of those things were much more part of the Scottish norm. And you're right that under Labour, New Labour under Blair, and of course under the Tories, and now of course under Keir Starmer, England has gone in this very different direction. Now it's become a sort of offshore capitalist free market regime of the European Union and attract investment on that basis. That is not Scotland's ethos. Scotland is very different. And that's where made people realise that actually we've focused a lot on Scandinavia in recent years, realised that Scotland could be more like, Denmark or Sweden, a social democratic country with good quality of public services. So there is that schism. But the important division with Sturgeon is that she realised that Alec was still a threat, and Alec wanted to come back and to lead the independence movement. So they conspired together, there's no doubt about it, to try and put Alec in prison. They dug up all these charges about sexual harassment and so on, which of course
hang on, Hugh. I mean, politicians can't do that. That's the job of the police, surely.
You're joking. Politicians can do anything. There was a group involved in the SNP and the leadership there who actively attempted to get Alec put into prison. They generated these campaigns, and they found people to come forward and say that they'd been sexually harassed. That case went to court. The prosecution service took it to court, and there was a majority of women on the jury, 9 women and 6 men, and Alec was found innocent in all the counts. But because the coverage of the press, which was sensational for the prosecution evidence and rather minimal for the defense evidence, Alex's reputation was traduced. And there's undoubtedly the case that Nicola was involved in that. There is a legal case for damages against the Scottish government, which was going ahead under Alec, and the executives of his estate are going to continue that case. It's likely to come into focus within the next year or so. And I know the lawyer involved. He's the best lawyer in Scotland. It was Tommy Sheridan's lawyer who won his case against the News of the World. And he's very confident that the case will be won. And when it comes out, the evidence will be clear that there was indeed a conspiracy to put Alec in prison, and by people right at the top of the SNP. And we know who they are. And many more people in Scotland know who they are. When that comes out, the SNP will be finished as a political force.
I mean, that's certainly one to keep an eye on. But I mean, it seems to me that that Sturgeon and her friends I mean, it seems incredible to almost torpedo this dream from for, as you said, almost hundreds of years. It seems incredible that just one person and a group of conspirators should we say, conspirators could do something like
alleged, that. Indeed, yes. Well, it is possible. You're in a small country, Scotland, of 5 million people. Everybody kens their feather in Scotland. In other words, knowledge gets around publicly, and I found it difficult to believe, but actually I saw the evidence that actually there were this group involved. And the problem is that when it went to court, the judge restricted access to all this information to the public. And Craig Murray got banged up for 8 months, 4 months, because in his blog and his coverage of the trial, the judge thought that he had revealed sufficient that people might be able to identify the people involved. I mean, I think she was wrong, and Craig might well be appealing that judgment as well. But people knew what was going on. There was a group of people, and as I say, the charges were thrown out by a jury of 9 women and 6 men. And yes, I think the truth is that they had become accepted into running devolution and forgotten to take their eye off the ball of independence.
Well, I mean, it sounds almost medieval, Hugh. The idea that you've got some sort of powerful ruler who can just destroy their political opponents. I mean, Craig, for example, has done a great service to humanity. And in fact, he's right. in a way, I mean, he's still like an ambassador for Scotland around the world. To try and destroy people like this, I mean, it does sound a bit medieval.
It is indeed. It's evil, to be frank, and that's what was an evil attempt to put Alec away in prison and to put him out the way of the independence debate. I think the truth is that the people in charge of the SNP had gone more interested in running devolution, and as I say, Nicola's interests seem to move on to the personal kind of agenda and things like gender identity and so on, rather than the big issues of independence. Now, certainly in terms of Craig's case, he still has an eye on coming back and being in the Scottish Parliament. And I always joke with him, he'll be our first foreign minister when we're independent, because there couldn't be anybody better. That's, of course, if he survives any of his little excursions abroad at the moment.
Well, I know. But look, there's also Alex RT programme.
Yes.
And also his vehement support for the Palestinians. These things have all made him really, MI6 and the London establishment really didn't like this guy. I mean, it's almost like they wish he would just, they thought that by his resignation he was then cast into outer darkness, but he certainly wasn't. Certainly sitting on an international satellite TV channel with his own programme.
Absolutely. And don't forget that the head of the civil service in Scotland is approved by the civil service in Westminster. And the head of the civil service in Scotland was obviously involved quite deeply, along with Nicola and others, in terms of orchestrating the campaign against Alex. And that, and don't forget that not only did Alex win his case at the trial, he also won £500,000 in damages from the Scottish government for the action they took against him. And this latest case, which is going to go ahead, is going to seek the damages for the damages to his reputation by this. So there could well be that our friends from British intelligence have been involved as well. In fact, to be frank, it would be surprising if they weren't, because This is a major threat to the breakup of the British state. And guess what Scotland's got that England still needs? It's our so-called nuclear independent deterrent, which, of course, if, the wars in Russia or Ukraine or indeed in the Middle East lead to tactical nuclear warfare, then the first place in Britain to be hit will be the nuclear bases in Faslane and the Clyde, and Glasgow might well suffer rather badly from that. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if British intelligence were not involved.
Okay, well, what about the RT programme? I mean, this was watched round the world. Bizarrely,
absolutely.
It was blocked in Britain.
I know. Right? I used to appear on it, and I appeared on RT radio and so on. And the truth was, it was actually, Alex said, we had never had any interference from RT on what we did and what we made. But of course, it was blocked in the UK because, a bit like Al Jazeera, which funnily enough seems to have disappeared from Freeview, or at least been relegated to number 251, where the reception is much more shaky. I have to watch it on YouTube to get clear reception from Al Jazeera these days. The truth is that the media in Britain are controlled by a small group of people, either who live here or live abroad, but in the interest of the ruling class in Britain, and that they want to exclude any contrary views. And even the so-called liberal papers like The Guardian are frankly pale imitations of what they used to be, and that they tend to reflect the prevailing view as well. So RT was seen as a threat. It was seen to be offering an alternative view, as is Al Jazeera. So it had to be closed down because, of course, well, I mean, it's just like the Novichok case, which has raised its head again 6 years after the events, no doubt because it's something to do with the Russia phobia that's around at the present time. Though Craig Murray's blog is worth reading, of course, on that, who shows us absolute pack of nonsense from start to finish, the whole Novichok nonsense.
Okay, so Hugh, what was your last meeting with, when did you last see Alex?
Oh, gosh. It was about 2 months ago. We had a National Council meeting. I'm on the National Council of Alba. And we had some internal problems and stuff like that. And I said to him, look, Alex, what I said to you when I joined Alba is I don't want to belong to just a small party that is run by you for your benefit. I want an open democratic party, which is an alternative to the SNP. And he said, Hugh, that's what we're going to get, which is why I joined. And I said, but I'm putting my faith in you to resolve these problems. And he was very grateful and said, thank you very much, and I intend to do that. And he was in the process of doing that. We're due to have a national conference in November, in the middle of November. And of course, it will now be a very different national conference. But I've been speaking to Kenny, who is the acting leader, Kenny McCaskill, the acting leader he was the deputy to Alec, and a very, very good man, Kenny, former Minister of Justice in Scotland. Old socialist, really good politics, really good vows. And he's determined that the Alba will continue. I think that Alba could be part of the government of Scotland in 2026. There is a prospect there. I think Labour, which did well in the parliamentary elections in July, is already becoming very unpopular in Scotland because of what they're doing down south. And as we say in Scotland, they're just a branch office in Scotland. They're told what to do. So all 37 Labour MPs have voted to keep the two-child cap. They voted to abolish the winter fuel payments. And already 3 by-elections in councils in Scotland, they've lost all 3. And the SNP have done well, and Alba have picked up votes. So I think by 2026, the Scottish parliamentary elections, Labour could be so unpopular that they will fail to win control, and that the SNP might be damaged by the court revelations, that Alba could pick up a substantial vote, and that between Alba, the SNP, and other independent supporting parties, we might get a majority for independence. And then at that point, I think we should declare independence. Never mind this referendum given. Just declare. The 200 countries in the UN, 180 of them have gone independent without referendums.
Wow.
Referendums are an optional extra. When the country wants it, we'll have it. And,
so we're going to have
Alex's memory will live.
Checkpoints on the A1 and the M6, eh?
No. We'll have a free and open border like we do between Ireland and the UK. And we're going to rename the Forth Road Bridge as the Alex Salmond Bridge in memory of Alec and many other things. He was a giant of a man, a great man, and sadly will be lost. But as he said, the dream will continue. And the
So
dream
what
is Scotland.
about, yeah, I mean, this is finally, what about, Alba aside, what about independence for Scotland? What do you see as the changes which will bring it about? I mean, I know you've said that you want to have a kind of universal declaration of independence sort of thing, but I mean, do you think we'll see it in our lifetime, genuine independence? And anyway, you can imagine Scotland, like Ireland, becoming independent from the British Empire, and then going and joining up with Brussels and being, having them as the bugbear, being dominated by them.
Well, Alba's position is that we should not rejoin the EU, that we should join EFTA, which gives us access to the single market of the EU, but is much more control of our own affairs, and let the people of Scotland decide in the future whether they want to rejoin the EU or not. You're quite right. I mean, I was now recently the amount of new office blocks down to Liffey. It's a remarkably different country from when I first went there in the 1960s. The truth is that actually Scotland could be that kind of country, but with a social democratic twist. Ireland's got more of a free market twist. Could be like Denmark. I spent a number of years in Denmark, had a Danish wife, where the quality of public services is much higher, the inequality is much less, where we don't spend lots of useless money on wars and so on. So Scotland could be different. I think it will happen, and probably not in my lifetime. I'm 80. Maybe in your lifetime, Tony. You sound just like a youngster to me. But what the demographics, as I say, the majority of Scotland's citizens under 55 are heavily in favour of independence. It's old folk like myself. We're a little more cautious and so on. And to guess the thing about them, Tony, they're dying out. And I think Scotland will be independent. It may take another 10 or another 20 years to happen. And I think Ireland will be united as well in the same time. And England will be left, maybe Wales will be independent by then. Will be left to become the offshore capital, the Singapore of Europe, which is what Keir Starmer seems to want it to be.
Yeah. All right. Okay, Hugh. How do people follow you, find you on social media?
Well, I'm on Facebook. I'm on Twitter. I'm not terribly good on Twitter, I must admit, but I'm on Facebook, so they can follow me there. And I correspond regularly in the Scottish media, and as I say, through Alba. So, but I don't do blogs because life's too short. I also edit the Edinburgh Music Review, which is an online music magazine which covers opera, classical music, folk music in Scotland and around the world. So that kind of keeps me busy.